December 17th, 1944, 05:30 hours, Hansfeld, Belgium. The pre-dawn silence of the Ardennes forest was shattered not by gunfire, but by the sickening cough and sputter of a dying engine. Inside the command Tiger tank of Kampfgruppe Peiper, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper slammed his fist against the steel hatch, the metallic clang a futile protest against the inevitable. Below, his driver, Unterscharführer Ursula, cycled the starter again. Nothing. The needle on the fuel gauge rested irrevocably on empty. A tense voice, tight with the panic of a seasoned soldier realizing his doom, crackled over the intercom from the radio operator's compartment. The reserve tank is also dry, Herr Obersturmbannführer. Peiper dismounted, his leather boots crunching on the frozen, unforgiving soil of Belgium. The scene around him was one of profound and catastrophic paralysis. The spearhead of the German offensive, Operation Wacht am Rhein, the last desperate gamble of the Third Reich, was frozen in place. 67 panzers, from the formidable Tigers to the nimble Panthers, along with 149 armoured half-tracks and nearly 5,000 of Germany's most elite Waffen-SS soldiers, were rendered immobile. The mighty war machine, designed for lightning-fast conquest, was starved of its lifeblood. Fuel. Through the thick, cold mist of the morning, Peiper's gaze fixed on the objective ahead. The small town of Hansfeld, recently abandoned by the U.S. 99th Infantry Division. The Americans had retreated in such haste that they left behind the ghostly echoes of their presence. Fires still flickered in oil drums, and cups of coffee sat abandoned, still warm to the touch. And then he saw it, a sight that seemed like a divine intervention, a gift from the god of war himself. Row upon row, stacked in neat, towering pyramids, were thousands of olive-drab American jerry cans, a fuel depot of staggering proportions. Peiper approached slowly, a sense of surreal reverence overcoming him. His adjutant, Hauptsturmführer Hans Gruner, swiftly pried open one of the cans. The sharp, potent smell of high-octane gasoline filled the air, a scent more precious than any perfume. Immediately, his men erupted into a frenzy of activity, a well-drilled ballet of survival, siphoning the American fuel into the thirsty tanks of the German war machine. As Peiper walked through this miraculous bounty, conducting a mental inventory, the sheer scale of it was overwhelming. Preliminary estimates suggested 50,000 gallons, enough to refuel his entire battle group and propel them toward their ultimate objective, the Meuse River. This single capture could potentially alter the entire trajectory of the Ardennes offensive. The Americans had casually abandoned in one forward depot more fuel than most German panzer divisions had seen in the last 6 months combined. Yet, as he stood amidst this incredible fortune, watching his men pour the enemy's fuel into their own vehicles, a dark, crushing realization began to settle over Joachim Peiper, as dense and chilling as the morning fog. This was not a miracle. It was an indictment. If the American army could afford to abandon such vast quantities of a resource that Germany would sacrifice entire divisions to protect, then the war was already lost. It was not merely a tactical miscalculation, it was a fundamental, catastrophic misunderstanding of the very nature of their enemy. Germany was fighting a war of scarcity against a nation that operated on a principle of unimaginable abundance. The strategic delusion, Germany's fuel crisis. To fully comprehend the shock of Peiper's discovery at Hansfeld, one must rewind 6 months. In June 1944, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, had presented the Führer with a report that should have terminated all offensive ambitions. The Allied strategic bombing campaign had systematically annihilated Germany's synthetic fuel industry, the lifeline of the Wehrmacht. Key hydrogenation plants at Leuna, Pölitz, Blechhammer, and Brooks were operating at less than 10% of their capacity. Production figures told a story of irreversible collapse, From 175,000 tons of fuel in April, output had plummeted to a mere 5,000 tons by September. The macroeconomic disparity was even more terrifying. In 1944, the United States produced a colossal 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, even when combining its dwindling synthetic production with captured Romanian fields, managed a paltry 33 million barrels, less than 2% of American output. The Third Reich was attempting to wage a highly mechanized blitzkrieg-style war with a logistical system that was, in effect, reverting to the horse-drawn era. This scarcity dictated strategy in the most desperate terms. The plan for the Ardennes offensive, as conceived by the German High Command, was not based on secure supply lines, but on a gambler's hope. Major Friedrich Simon of the Wehrmacht Logistics Command had calculated that reaching the port of Antwerp would require 4.5 million gallons of fuel. Hitler allocated 5 million on paper, but due to crippled rail networks and a lack of trucks, only half of that ever reached the front. The entire operational plan was predicated on a single, revealing directive: capture enemy supplies. This was not a sign of aggressive confidence, but a confession of terminal weakness. The American Colossus, logistics as a weapon of war. While German commanders prayed for captured fuel dumps, the American military was perfecting the science of logistics on an industrial scale. They constructed the Pluto, pipeline under the ocean system across the English Channel, and a vast network of pipelines snaking across France. Simultaneously, the famed Red Ball Express, a massive convoy of thousands of trucks, operated around the clock, delivering over 12,500 tons of supplies daily to the advancing front lines. By December 1944, American forces in Europe were consuming 1.2 million gallons of fuel per day, and their logistical system was delivering 1.4 million. They were not just sustaining their operations, they were actively accumulating reserves while engaged in heavy combat. This was a concept utterly alien to the German experience. Joachim Peiper was no fool. At 29, he was a decorated veteran of the Eastern Front, a holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, and he understood a brutal truth of modern warfare. Fuel was more critical than ammunition. A tank without shells was a pillbox. A tank without fuel was merely a static steel coffin. His Kampfgruppe was designated the Schwerpunkt, the main effort, of the entire offensive. At the final briefing, his superior, General Sepp Dietrich, had been brutally candid. "You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse if you capture American supplies." The official fuel allocation for Peiper's entire command was 31,000 gallons, enough for perhaps 50 miles of combat. The distance to the Meuse was 65 miles. The mathematics of failure were baked into the operation from its very inception. The offensive unfolds, the race for drops in an ocean. When the offensive began on December 16th, the contrast between the two armies was immediately apparent. The initial German artillery barrage was massive, expending more shells in 2 hours than had been allocated for entire operations earlier in the war. Yet this display of firepower masked the rot beneath. Peiper's column, bogged down on narrow, muddy tracks that German cartographers had optimistically marked as highways, immediately fell behind schedule. At the village of Lanzerath, they were held up for a critical 10 hours by a mere 18 American soldiers. During this delay, German tanks and vehicles sat idling, burning through their precious, meticulously measured fuel reserves. By the time they fought their way into Hansfeld at dawn on December 17th, Peiper's Kampfgruppe had covered only 20 miles, but had consumed over 40% of its allocated fuel. At this rate, they would run dry long before even sighting the Meuse. This context makes the discovery of the 50,000-gallon depot not just a relief, but a profound psychological event. As his men refueled, more disturbing details emerged. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann, who spoke English, found shipping manifests in the depot office. The papers detailed a journey of staggering logistical prowess. This gasoline had been shipped from Texas to New York, across the U-boat-infested Atlantic to Liverpool, across the Channel to Normandy, and then trucked over 400 miles to this forward depot in the Ardennes, a 6,000-mile journey completed in under 6 weeks. Hoffman showed the papers to Peiper, who read them twice, his face turning ashen. Both men understood the implication. They were facing an enemy with a global supply chain of unparalleled efficiency and resilience. Further discoveries deepened the sense of awe and despair. Privates found stacks of the Stars and Stripes newspaper from just 2 days prior, with headlines celebrating the opening of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun, capable of delivering 300,000 gallons per day. A single pipeline was delivering more fuel daily than Kampfgruppe Peiper would use in its entire thrust toward the Meuse. The inferno of abundance, Stavelot and the point of no return. Refueled by this captured bounty, Peiper's column surged forward, reaching the town of Stavelot by December 18th. Intelligence suggested the town held a massive American fuel depot, over 2 million gallons, enough to guarantee their breakthrough. But as the lead German elements approached, they were met with an apocalyptic sight. American combat engineers, under Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, had been ordered to deny the fuel to the enemy at all costs. They doused the vast stockpile, 289,000 gallons of gasoline stored in jerry cans across 15 acres, with its own fuel, and ignited it with white phosphorus grenades. The resulting inferno shot flames hundreds of feet into the air, creating a pillar of black smoke visible for miles. The fire raged for 3 days, consuming a volume of fuel that exceeded the entire German allocation for the Ardennes offensive. Peiper stood on his turret, watching the flames. His driver later recalled his commander's bleak observation. "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons to deny them to us. What are we doing here?" This single act of destruction was more devastating than any battlefield defeat. It was a demonstration of power so absolute that it rendered German courage and skill irrelevant. Across the Ardennes, American engineers systematically destroyed over 8 million gallons of fuel in the first week of the offensive, more than Germany had been able to gather for its last great gamble. The inevitable collapse. Tactics succumbed to logistics. The aftermath of Stavelot was a rapid, irreversible decline. Peiper's advance became a desperate, fuel-starved lunge. Tanks were abandoned, not due to combat damage, but because their tanks were empty. Radio intercepts via Ultra confirmed the critical German shortage, and American commanders issued orders to destroy all fuel threatened with capture. The disparity was now playing out in real time. While Peiper's forces were consolidating their last 8,000 gallons for a final push, American forces surrounding them were receiving allocations of hundreds of thousands of gallons per day. The U.S. 31st Infantry Division, the 82nd Airborne, and the 3rd Armored Division had a combined fuel allocation for a single day that was over 300 times greater than what Peiper now possessed. General Patton's famous pivot of the 3rd Army north to relieve Bastogne, a maneuver considered logistically impossible by German standards, consumed 350,000 gallons for the redeployment alone, and was accomplished in 3 days. By December 23rd, Kampfgruppe Peiper was surrounded near La Glaise. Of the 119 tanks and assault guns that began the offensive, 39 were still operational but completely immobilized, sitting ducks. Peiper gave the order to drain the last drops of fuel, destroy the vehicles, and attempt to break out on foot. Of his original 5,000 men, only about 770 escaped. The aftermath, the shattering of an illusion. The psychological impact of this logistical discovery reverberated through the German ranks more powerfully than any bomb. Letters from soldiers, despite censorship, carried the demoralizing truth. They wrote of Americans who washed their clothes in gasoline, fed chocolate to dogs, and fired artillery shells in celebration of Christmas. The myth of American softness and decadence collapsed upon contact with the reality of their industrial might. How could the master race, scraping for every liter of synthetic fuel, hope to defeat an enemy that could casually waste more than Germany could ever produce? This realization reached the highest levels of command. Field Marshal Walter Model, upon reading reports of the captured and destroyed American supplies, reportedly stated, "We are not fighting the same war." Even at Nuremberg, German leaders consistently cited logistics, particularly fuel, as the decisive factor in their defeat. The war had been transformed from a contest of tactics and will into a cold, mathematical equation of industrial production, and the Axis powers had lost long before the first shot was fired in the Ardennes. The abandoned Tiger tank at La Glaise, now a museum piece, stands as a permanent monument to this truth. Its formidable 80mm gun is silent, its thick armor intact, but its fuel gauge remains eternally on empty. It is a testament to the moment when the romantic ideal of the warrior was finally and irrevocably superseded by the impersonal, overwhelming power of logistics and industrial production. Joachim Peiper's discovery at Hansfeld was not of fuel, but of futility. He learned that Germany was not fighting a military, but an economic system so vast that its waste was their treasure, and its abundance was their doom.